Welcome everyone to the Rise of Worker to Worker Organising with Eric Blanc. My name is Sarah Woolley. I'm the General Secretary of the BFAWU and the President of the General Federation of Trade Unions. This is now the eighth and final session in the GFTU Educational Trust's strategy series. We hope that you will watch the previous ones, including the one tonight's follows, which is the last one that we had, Strategies for Activist Development with Harry Hahn, and they're all available on our YouTube channel. So please do go back and watch them if you missed any. If you can, we ask that you consider donating to the trust and become a friend to help us to continue delivering radical independent education for the whole trade union movement, because nobody else is doing sessions like these. This series, the strategy series, was put together because strategy is not just a word. Strategy is about how well we within the trade union and wider labour movement build power and capacity to improve workers' lives. The employers have a strategy, the managers have a strategy, and it's absolutely vital that as a united labour movement we build our own. This series will include discussions from leaders and has included discussions from leading thinkers on reviving the trade union movement, how we build union strategy, the role of women and feminist approaches to our unions, strategies for developing activists, and the capacity to win campaigns big and small. This is a webinar, which means you can see us and listen to us chatting away, but we cannot see you and you can't see each other. Feel free to use the chat throughout the call, but to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll ask your questions to Eric directly. We'll give Eric a maximum of 30 minutes for his presentation before opening it up to your questions. And we want to remind you all at this time that during the call, we will be following the GFTU Educational Trust Behaviour Statement, which will be put as a link in the chat now. So if you have any concerns, please read and follow that policy. And just before I do your formal introduction, Eric, if you don't mind, I know we've got a group of comrades having a watch party tonight to listen to you from Pelican House. So it's absolutely fantastic that they've done that, and it just, more groups should follow suit as we move into the strategy series next year. So enough from me. I'm delighted to introduce Eric Blanc, author of the books We Are the Union, How Worker to Worker Organising. I'll have to put my teeth back in tonight. Is Revitalising Labour and Winning Big. Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics. Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire between 1882 and 1917. Eric is an assistant professor of labour studies at Rutgers University, researching new workplace organising, strikes, digital labour activism and working class politics. He has a newsletter of his research, and I'm sure we'll put a link to that in the chat so people can sign up to that too. His writings have appeared in journals such as Politics and Society, New Labour Forum and Labour Studies Journal, as well as publications such as The Nation, The Guardian and Jacobin. A long-time labour activist, Eric is an organiser trainer in the Emergency Workplace Organising Committee, and if you've not looked up that, please do go have a look, because some of the stuff that they've done is fabulous. And he helped co-found that in March 2020. He directs the Worker to Worker Collaborative, which is a centre to help unions and rank and file groups scale up their efforts by expanding their members' involvement and leadership. So without any further ado, Eric, over to you, and we'll ask some questions when you've finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks to the GFTU. Thanks to all of you out there. Appreciate you taking the time. What I'm going to do is I have a presentation. I'll pull up my screen in a second, and it's to essentially walk you through some of the big arguments that I made in my recent book about the recent labor uptick in the United States, and I'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so worker-to-worker organizing, a scalable model to defeat Trumpism and the billionaires, and I would say the far right internationally. Okay, so the starting point for the presentation and for the book I just wrote, We Are the Union, is trying to make sense of the recent labor uptick in the United States, basically since after the pandemic, and at least up through Trump. And we can talk more about whether it's continuing today, and it is in part. But the book and the presentation really focuses on 2022, 2023, 2024. And you can look at this is a graph showing the number of workers organized per union staffer in the US. So it gives you a sense of essentially both the dramatic increase in numbers of workers unionized, and also the fact that this took place despite an overall decrease in the number of staffers, staff organizers that the union movement employed, partly because it's been underfunding new organizing. And so this recent labor uptick has taken place despite the labor movement's overall lack of focus, at least the leadership's lack of focus on new organizing in the US, and in part because the model of organizing, which I'm going to talk about here, worker to worker organizing, depends far less on staff than more traditional unionizing. And so just last year alone, 2024, over 100,000 workers unionized in the United States, slightly less the 2 years prior, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers unionizing in the US over the last few years, and not just in small battles, but against some of the biggest companies in the world. First contracts have been won against Apple, Barnes and Noble. They forced Starbucks to the bargaining table, and is what, one of the most important drives. Amazon organizing continues to spread. So this has been like a really significant experience. And what I want to try to do then is impart some of the lessons from that. And that's what I try to do in the book. And I'll give you the really short version of the takeaways over the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes. One of the big arguments of the book is very straightforward, and somewhat simple, which is that you can and should organize your workplace. So the book tells the story of a lot of rank and file workers that on their own initiative began organizing efforts. So you can see here on the left, these are workers from Burgerville, which is a chain, a fast food chain on the west coast of the United States. It became the first unionized fast food chain in all of the United States. People said you couldn't unionize fast food. The workers, this is the theory, was that the turnover was too high, the workplaces were too small, young people are apathetic, XYZ. Those are the arguments. And nevertheless, they did it and they won. On the right, you can see the Starbucks Workers United. This was the first union drive this was a picture of the first union election in the South. That's a person named Maggie Carter who organized in Tennessee. This is the news when she won. They saw that she had won. When she saw that they had won their union election, the votes got announced. So the book tries to tell the story of these workers, both because it's important, it's an essential part of how these drives won, but also because hopefully it'll be inspiring that if you read the book or if you just are thinking about it, you should understand that you don't have to wait for anybody to start organizing. A union is you and your coworkers building power collectively. You don't have to wait for permission from above. You don't have to wait for permission from an established union. It's good to connect with an established union. It's good to get those resources, but particularly to get started, you can do that on your own. And a union is essentially workers acting collectively. The book is based off of a survey. I did a very large scale, time intensive survey. I reached out to every single union drive of 2022 in the United States. So that's over 2,000 drives, and reached out to every single one of them. They filled out a survey, and I got a lot of interesting data from that, including what tactics they used to win. So you can get a good sense here. And this is a cheat sheet if you're thinking about unionizing your workplace, or maybe you have a friend or family member who's in a non-union shop and they wouldn't even know where to begin, right? A lot of people say, I wouldn't even know where to start. Well, this is how you start. In some ways, it's as simple as talking with your coworkers. A lot of these tactics are essentially different sides of you talking with your coworkers, finding out what their issues are and proposing to them, well, we can resolve these issues only if we collectively act. You're not going to be able to resolve those individually. So you can see here, building an organizing committee, 93% of drives, one-on-one organizing conversations with 70% plus coworkers, 87%. Make a list of your coworkers, assess their support. uh, inoculate against union busting. So the list goes on, but you can see essentially these are these classic tactics that workers used. And the irony is that they use these tactics even better than established unions often. So even though these were very worker-led, bottom-up, often by very inexperienced workers, they ended up doing the classic organizing better than established unions, in part because good organizing is based off of worker leadership. And because workers were taking the lead from the start, they were able to do sort of the heart of good organizing even better than when very talented or very experienced staffers came in and tried to sort of foment this from the outside. It proved to be more effective when workers themselves were in the lead. So I'm going to focus for the sake of this presentation on some of the bigger arguments about the book. We can talk more about the tactics they used, but in some ways those are time-tested, long-standing. I don't know if I don't think I have like a tremendously new take on the tactics for good organizing. I think that those are um, sort of well understood, and we can talk more about them. My book tries to make a new argument on the question of how it would be possible to organize at scale. How would it be possible? What does it take to organize tens of millions of workers? So it's not just a book or a question of what tactics do you need to win campaigns. Those are important, and we can talk more about those. But it's a distinct question. How do you organize enough campaigns to turn around union density, to transform our countries, to defeat the billionaires? And so to give you a sense of this, this is a graph of the relationship between income inequality and union density. And what you can see essentially is that when union density goes up, income inequality goes down and vice versa. And actually, I have this graph I don't have in front of me right now. For the UK, it's the exact same. So this is I can share it with you. So I see Sarah's nodding. But yeah, so this is a relationship essentially between the power imbalance between workers and bosses. And this power imbalance is at the root of all of the major crises that our countries are facing, whether it's the rise of the far right, climate catastrophe, entrenched economic and racial inequality. Um, this is the central question we're facing, but we should be really sober about what it would take. Because if you look at this decline in union density, to turn this around, you literally need to organize tens of millions of workers, right? The scale of what we're talking about is oftentimes underestimated. So it's not sufficient to say, well, this is the good tactic to win a campaign. We actually need strategies and structures that can organize by the tens of millions. And that's what the book tries to address. As you can see, how to unionize at scale. We need to organize tens of millions of new workers. Here's the cover of the book, which you should get. I think somebody drop it in. And if you don't have money, I can send you a PDF. But in the UK, unlike other countries outside the US, it's relatively easy to get a copy of the book. So check it out. In the US, and maybe we can talk more in the discussion about the extent to which it's true for what's considered organizing in the UK. But in the US, the best practice model for what is considered, standard organizing, which I call staff-intensive organizing. This is the norm, is you need one staffer for about every 100 workers you're trying to organize. And it's very costly. So this is the model of organizing that is prevalent and that in many ways I'm trying to push back on in the book. Uh, it can be very effective. So my argument is not that this type of organizing is inherently ineffective. There's a lot of different types of staff-intensive organizing. At its best, it really can help train and identify worker leaders and win. But the problem is, and this is the argument of the book, it can't do so widely enough. It can't scale. It's just too costly, both in terms of money and in time, to organize tens of millions of workers. And so therefore, worker-to-worker unionism, which I'll explain what it is the only plausible path to scaling up union power in today's conditions. And I want to talk about this today's conditions part because this is maybe underestimated. Part of what I try to do in the book is take a really, I think, hard-headed look at how much harder it is, frankly, to unionize in our contemporary, atomized, decentralized service economy compared to 100 years ago, in which in the US and certainly in the UK, labor was concentrated more around hard industry. The working class was more cohesive because people tended to socialize much more with their coworkers, live next to their coworkers, oftentimes work in big factories. And so there was a level of pre-existing class cohesion that frankly has been either obliterated or dramatically undercut. And so in today's conditions, It takes a lot more fostering on the part of organizers and unions to win widely. In other words, it's more costly to organize. It's not that you can't organize workers, but because there's fewer pre-existing ties of class sort of cohesion, it takes more work, to organize one shop, and it takes a lot more work to organize tens of millions of workers. And so you have to have an answer for what it will take in today's conditions to unionize. You can't just replicate the model of 100 years ago in which maybe you could concentrate on a couple of the most biggest factories. And then because those were so central, the power of those factories and that sort of class um, militancy would just percolate out for the rest of the class. That's not as possible today. It's far less possible in today's conditions. Nevertheless, we should look to the past to get a sense of the possibilities for a more grassroots type of unionism. And so I want to give you a sense of the possibilities, even if the tactics are a little bit different. As you can see here, the best practice for union organizing, staff-intensive organizing today is one staffer for every 100 workers. And you can compare that to the staffing models of the 1930s. So SWOC is a Steelworkers Organizing Committee. This was in the 1930s, early 40s, the drive that unionized the steel industry. This was the biggest, most important union drive of the 1930s. And it was also the most top-down. That's why I include this one, because this is like the example that's always pointed to in the 1930s of the most staff-intensive. This was like the auto workers, for instance, were much more bottom-up. But the steel drive was like run from the top, very staff and heavy, for the era. Just look at the numbers. They had one staffer for every 1,700 workers compared to one staffer for every 100 workers. So this is, by today's standards, that was like an exceptionally bottom-up grassroots, not top-heavy drive. And then UE, which is the electric workers, which is more of a left-wing union, is even more bottom-up. One staffer for every 2,200 workers unionized. And so the question then is, how do you get back to that type of scalability in today's conditions? And what I argue is not that you can replicate exactly the 1930s, because as I mentioned before, it's harder to organize in today's conditions. You need more of this fostering. And so there's a logic to the staff-intensive organizing model, which is that there's an important role for staff or for organizers to play, which is helping identify worker leaders, helping build strategy, helping encourage fight backs. And so staff intensive organizing compared to worker organizing, what you try to do is not get rid of the types of things that staffers normally do today, which remain important, but essentially you need to train workers to be able to do those. So this is the visual image of the argument of the book, is that you're building essentially a new layer of leadership. So it's not just staffers talking to workers who are organizing their shops, but you have volunteer worker leaders who are essentially taking on the role that staffers normally do. And you still have some staff helping coordinate. It's not that you just eliminate staff completely. You actually need more staff and more support. But if you're going to do it at scale, you need to train worker leaders to be able to do most of the things that staff normally do. That's the argument of the book, and that's essentially the heart of what the new model is. And so what does that mean concretely? Maybe that's a little abstract. I boiled it down to three major tasks. There's other things as well, but there's three major components that worker leaders have learned to do. And so again, this argument that I'm making is not something I just came up with in my head. It's essentially a generalization trying to make sense of what has happened on the ground in the US. So this is a generalization based on my research of Starbucks, the auto workers drives, higher ed, journalism. We'll talk more about the specific campaigns. But what did they do? What is worker-to-worker unionism? Three things. What differentiates it? It's workers take on responsibilities normally reserved for staff, including initiating organizing efforts. So it's not just the union decides where we're going to organize. Oftentimes it's the workers themselves at a given shop decide to organize, and then oftentimes they'll vote on which union to affiliate with. But the organizing in a systematic way begins before they're even affiliated with a union. That's oftentimes the case. Training and supporting others. Even sometimes if the union initiates it, another thing that differentiates this model is that instead of having a full-time staffer training the new drive that reaches out, it'll be a worker training and encouraging the new drive. And so to give an example, in the Starbucks unionization, it started in just one store in Buffalo, New York, upstate New York. They won one drive, and to their great surprise, it caught the imagination of Starbucks workers all over the country. And if they had tried to do a staff-intensive normal organizing campaign, they just couldn't have organize nationally because they weren't planning. They didn't have enough staff. They literally just didn't have enough staff or money to hire enough staff to talk to all these workers who were reaching out. So they actually had to have the workers themselves from these Starbucks shops in Buffalo jump on Zoom calls and talk to all of these coworkers all across the country just to give them basic tools and encouragement for how they could start self-organizing. So that training and supporting others, workers are doing it for the most part rather than staff. And then the third piece is strategizing. In traditional union organizing, oftentimes the biggest picture strategy questions um, are determined by staff full-timers. Workers maybe at best can have a say over some of the tactics used, for what to do at this or that shop. But the big picture strategy is oftentimes set by union leaders and full-time staffers. In these drives, staffers have played a role. They've been supportive, but it's been workers have been at the table making a lot of the big decisions about how to move forward, when to file for a union election, how to beat the bosses, and that's a new phenomenon. Okay, and so what you can see then, if you look at the numbers, is that the recent drives have replicated the scalability of the 1930s. So SBW, the Starbucks Workers United, you can see it had one staffer for every 2,000 workers. UE in higher ed, so in the United Electrical Workers Union now has grown by a lot by organizing graduate student workers, 2,300 workers. And then also, this isn't just sort of college educated workers in auto, in manufacturing, which is still a very important part of the economy. The UAW, the United Auto Workers, have unionized and at a scalability with one staffer for about every 1,800 workers. And so by using this new model, you're getting back to the sort of scalability, the potential for growth of the 1930s. You can also just see this in the aggregate workers organized per staffer. 2023 was much higher than 2022. 2022 itself was much higher than the years prior. So, as I mentioned before, the novelty of this is not so much in the tactics used. You remember like the graph or the table I gave you of all of the common tactics used by these drives. These are classic deep organizing tactics. Talking to your coworkers, building organizing committee, mapping the workplace. And so if you've read No Shortcuts or have heard of the work of Jane McAlevey, oftentimes these workers were reading that type of training. They were trying to do their best to do deep organizing. And so the novelty is not that they invented new tactics. The novelty is that they were doing it without very high reliance on staff. And it's important to make that distinction because sometimes people say, oh, if you're going to organize in a new way, you have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You have to sort of start everything from scratch. I don't think that's necessarily true. It's possible for workers to do a lot of these things, the kind of best practices, even without intensive staff support. And so what I want to do now is give an example of what I think the union that has most robustly developed this worker-to-worker organizing program. And that's the News Guild, which organizes media workers, journalists, mostly in newspapers. And they've been doing it for longer than any other union. They even predate the pandemic. Their kind of upsurge really began like 2018. And so partly because of that, they've had more time to develop what they call the member organizer program. And the philosophy of the News Guild's member organizer program is very explicitly that every worker leader should learn how to do what a staff person normally does. And so you can see here, this is one of their graphics where they have this philosophy called learn, do, teach, where workers have to learn these things, that they have to do them, and then they have to teach them to others. And they're extremely systematic about this. And just to give you one of the tools that they use, it's not just that they're hoping workers will learn these tasks and there's sort of, even just by experience over time that they'll learn them. There's a systematic training program. And this is one of the tools they use. They have a benchmark tracker. So it gives you all of the different benchmarks of what worker leaders should learn to do. So you can see it, inoculation training, shop stewards training, how to facilitate a meeting, work through a challenge with an OC member, all of these different tasks. Not only do they need to learn it, but then they have to do it and they have to teach it. And so the way they have that is that you do it in your campaign at your own workplace, but then they have these monthly trainings in which workers themselves have to teach it back to others based on their experiences. And they have pods, and this is another sort of innovation of the News Guild, of 10 to 12 workers nationally in which they're sharing their experiences to learn how to do this from others and to give them encouragement. So the type of encouragement and support that oftentimes staff have to do, workers are giving it to each other, both through these national monthly trainings and through these sort of constant chats, of about 10 to 12 workers that that they call pods. And so I want to just briefly conclude by talking about the current moment. As you may have heard, a man named Donald Trump got elected to the United States presidency. He's not a friend of labor. Um, that's the nicest thing I can say about it. No, but to be serious, we're in this crazy situation. It's like an authoritarian coup in the United States in which the richest people on earth are eluding the government and essentially launching an all-out war against the working class. And so in that context, it's worth asking, can this labor uptick continue? And I want to give a few thoughts on that. Partly, I'm optimistic because, as I explained in the book, the reasons for the rise of this type of organizing aren't only short term. Some of them were short term. So the COVID pandemic certainly was an impact. The tight labor market, we had a very tight labor market. That was an incentive for organizing. The NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board under Biden. So for all of Biden's crimes in Gaza, he was actually pretty good on unions in the US. And he appointed a good labor board, which made it easier to unionize. Okay, so those are short-term factors that are gone, and so those are obstacles to organizing right now because they're not currently there. But there's two other factors that are continuing to drive things forward, and why I think that this type of worker-to-worker organizing is likely to continue to be an important factor. And we're already starting to see that in the resistance against Trump. The first is youth radicalization, and the second is digital tools. And so I just want to briefly sketch out why those are important. So, you know, I don't want to overhype digital tools. I don't think that digital tools can sort of substitute for good labor organizing, but they do change the terrain of organizing, and they make it possible, frankly, for workers to self-organize on a scale that's much easier than they could have 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the reason for that is essentially it lowers the costs of communication. So if you don't have to rent a hall, but you can jump on a Zoom call, well, then you don't have to affiliate within a union immediately. You can sort of start self-organizing. If you can text your coworkers instead of have to print out flyers. Again, these are mechanisms through which workers with very few resources can start self-organizing. And so because the costs of communication and organization have gone lower, it just makes the relationship of forces between staff and workers significantly different than it was even 20 years ago. So the space for bottom-up organizing is a lot higher. Things that weren't possible 15 years ago are now possible. You can mentor as a worker another worker in any part of your country, or even maybe part of the world, in a way you couldn't have done in the pre-Zoom era. So what I talked about before with Starbucks workers mentoring their coworkers all across the country, in the past, you could only do that kind of grassroots mentoring, worker to worker, on a local level. Just by definition, you had to meet with them in person, essentially. Now, in the digital era, you can have worker to worker mentoring anywhere across the country. So it dramatically expands the scope for this type of organizing. And it also means that you can try to go viral. It's easier to go viral, even if the national media is not talking about you. Part of the reason that there's so much enthusiasm for labor in the US is that labor is kind of sexy because you have these viral videos of workers walking out and unionizing, and over TikTok, it like really has made a big difference. It's caught the imagination of young people in the US, maybe more so than in other countries. And so the digital piece is important because it's not just hype, in the abstract. Hype is attention. It gets people excited about the labor movement. If you can't get people excited about the labor movement, how are you going to organize tens of millions of workers? So I do think that that piece is important. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's the youth radicalization piece. Um, I found in the data and the research that really the layer of workers that were driving these efforts were young, very young. The average age of worker leaders in 2022 was 27 years old, and they were leftists. So almost 50% of these worker leaders consider themselves radicals. The next highest was progressive. So it's essentially young left-leaning workers who've been iced out by the system, that see that capitalism can't really offer, especially neoliberal capitalism, can't offer them a future. They see climate catastrophe. They see the billionaires just running amok across the world. That's radicalized a lot of young people, and they see the union movement as the best mechanism to change the world. And that's a very promising dynamic that I don't think is going to go away. And with frankly, the crisis of centrist politics, which has led in a lot of countries to the rise of the far right, it also creates an opportunity for the left and for the labor movement to channel this anti-system anger into a productive sort of anti-billionaire class conscious solidaristic avenue. And so you can see one of the findings I found from the survey I did of worker leaders is that they were influenced not just by other labor struggles, but by other social movements as well. And so the biggest three influences on leading these workers to end up unionizing their workplace beyond labor were Black Lives Matter, the Bernie Sanders campaign, and LGBTQ issues. So you can see how these issues sort of fed into the labor movement. They weren't necessarily separate. They were sort of a feeding river into what ended up becoming a labor uptick. And then I'll just end by talking a bit about this current moment we're in, where obviously it's horrific. We can talk more about what's going on with Trump in the Q&A if you're interested. Trump is trying his best to install an authoritarian regime in the US. He's hasn't succeeded yet. In part, he hasn't succeeded because there's a lot of resistance, and what he's doing is very unpopular. And so, the good news is that there's been a lot of pushback, and what he's doing is very unpopular. And a lot of the organizing I've been doing for the last 6 months has been with the federal workers. So you've probably heard Elon Musk and Trump are just radically downsizing the federal government, talking about they took away union rights or trying to take away union rights for 1 million federal workers through an executive order, just saying overnight we're canceling your collective bargaining agreements. They're doing mass layoffs of 100,000 workers, or they're trying to. And in response to that, unfortunately, the major federal unions have only done sort of the legal route. They've done lawsuits. And it's good, obviously it's good for there to be lawsuits, and these have slowed down some of the Trump agenda. But a lot of these lawsuits, frankly, are losing now because the courts are conservative. And then it's not even clear, that we shouldn't have too much confidence that the Supreme Court, which is led by Trump appointees, is going to side with the federal workers. So there has to be resistance as well. And unfortunately, the rank and file has stepped up, and local union presidents have stepped up. And there's a new network called the Federal Unionist Network, which is sort of proof of concept that this type of worker-to-worker unionism is important, not just for offensive battles to unionize Starbucks, Amazon, but it's also really important, just as essential for the big defensive battles against authoritarianism, because the same scale problem is there. There's over 2 million federal workers in the United States, and there's very few staff. These are very weak unions. And so unless workers can organize themselves by the millions, they're not going to be able to defeat Donald Trump. So what I've been doing is working with the Federal Unionist Network, which is a network of federal workers across unions, and they've organized, significant protests. You might have heard on April 5th, there was these big protests called the Hands Off protests. We had over 6 million people in the streets all across the US. The Federal Unionist Network took the initiative on getting the whole labor movement to mobilize. Most unions weren't even planning on doing protests, and not even the federal unions. But the fund took the initiative and was able to sort of drag the rest of the labor movement into mobilizing. What ended up being the biggest protest yet against Donald Trump. And so we're in the midst of this battle right now. And I think that all of the indications are that what Trump is doing is extremely unpopular. He's overreaching. He's messing up the economy with the tariffs, but also, people don't want their Social Security, their pensions to be destroyed. They don't want their Medicaid to be destroyed. They support unions. He's going after unions at a moment where unions are extremely popular, even amongst Republicans. You have 50% of Republicans are in support of unions. Nobody likes what he's doing, except for the billionaire class. And so this is a very, very volatile moment. Trump thinks he's much more powerful than he is, and I think he's leading towards a potential social explosion. So I don't want to make predictions about what will happen, but all this is to say that the worker resistance that we saw over the last few years hasn't gone away. In fact, I think it might be more urgent than ever. So I will leave it at that.